Do these missing facts change anything about Christianity? Metatron did a video, What They Never Told You, the Truth About Jesus' Arrest and Missing Facts, recently about some of the details regarding the arrest of Jesus. And we're going to be looking at them from a historical point of view. Now, Metatron does a historical analysis of the topics around the scriptures, the topics around the Bible, and other topics regarding ancient culture and things from antiquity. I do not know if Metatron is a theist, is a believer in God, is a follower of Jesus. I don't know anything about his views. All I know is he's Italian and he makes some pretty fascinating videos.
Jesus' arrest is of course a pivotal moment within Christianity, occurring slightly after the Last Supper while he and his disciples were in the Garden of Gethsemane. This specific event is mentioned in all 4 gospel accounts, but even though the gospels say similar things, they don't all say the same thing. And the problem alluded to is the fact that there is one word specifically in Greek that I'd like to focus our attention on today. This word.
Okay. By the way, the idea that the reason why there's different accounts in the Gospels, in the 4 different Gospels, because they're written from 4 different perspectives that are going to give you 4 different details, right? So that some people kind of use that as like, oh, contradictions in the Bible. It's like, no, they're just different people wrote the books that are going to have different perspectives.
We have Judas accompanied by Roman guards reaching the garden, and once Jesus is identified, either with a famous kiss or by him speaking out depending on the version, we imagine the Roman guards making the arrest. Now let me ask you a question. As I was describing this event, you were probably imagining it in your mind. Now when you heard the sentence Judas accompanied by Roman guards, how many guards did you imagine? 2? 10? Now check this out. Let's see what scripture tells us in English first. The 3 synoptic gospels describe the Roman soldiers accompanying Judas with the word multitude, great multitude in the King James Version.
You know, I never caught that it said multitude, large crowd in the multiple translations, right? He has the New Catholic Bible pulled up here. It says a large crowd, multitude. I never noticed that it said multitude or large crowd. So this is an interesting point he's making here.
Whereas in the New Catholic Version and the New International Version, we have the words crowd, great crowd. Let's have a look at the interlinear Greek English. In the interlinear, we have indeed the word ochlos, which does translate crowd. Even more specifically, it can be interpreted as a dynamic crowd. In the King James Version, John uses the word band of men. In the New Catholic Version, we have a detachment of soldiers. Same in the New International Version. So once again, let's have a look at the interlinear Greek English. Here is where the situation becomes interesting. We have the word spiran, most likely pronounced speran in period, which translates as cohort. And this
cohort. Okay, so that's one of the words used, and a cohort is apparently not the way many of us envisioned how this went down, probably.
A cohort is the 10th part of a legion. That's 600 armed men.
600 armed men. So Metatron is making the argument here that it wasn't just a couple guards, 5, 10 guards. It is potentially a legion of guards, 600 guards that show up to take Jesus into custody during his arrest.
12 men preaching turning the other cheek. Now this is a tactical choice. What justifies this sort of military mobilization? What were the Romans expecting? Were they preemptively preparing for a possible armed rebellion? Keep reading the event, we indeed see that a weapon was involved. During the arrest, one of Jesus' disciples decides to draw a bladed weapon and try to defend his master.
Right.
3 of the 4 gospels do not tell us who this specific disciple is, but John does and identifies him.
John's just out here snitching. John's like, yeah, it's Peter. The other 3 don't name him, and then John does. That's so funny. But we do know that Jesus did have zealots that traveled with him, and zealots were a part of this anti-establishment, I don't want to say cult, but like undercover group that was looking to overthrow the Romans, right? So whether those folks were still in that life or not, those folks were a part of Jesus' ministry. So I also think it's important to note that not just Peter with the sword, but there was also zealots that traveled with Jesus.
Simon Peter. Usually when we read this, we tend to focus on the miracle side of it. So Simon Peter cuts the ear off of one of the Jews and Jesus heals him. Today I'd like to focus on the very fact that Simon Peter had a sword in the first place. Because what this tells us is that at least some of Jesus' followers did have weapons on.
There's also times where Jesus, tells them to not bring a sword, and then later on, afterwards, when he sends them on, he tells them to bring a sword, right? So there is there is something there where I don't think it's just a tool.
Anti-Roman propaganda was what the Jesus' opponents were trying to use against him, but how did the Romans perceive him and his disciples? Did they perceive them as rebels? Well, we may have another indication to that, still in scripture. Let's read. We now fast forward to the crucifixion itself. Now, as you know, Jesus is not alone in the Golgotha, and with him there are two men. Now, usually these two men are considered to be thieves or perhaps robbers, but once again, through the lenses of correct literal interpretation of the original text, we may find out more, much more, about who these two men actually were. Now let's read the passage in English and then I'll show you a problem or an inconsistency with some of the translations, in fact, the majority. Depending on which of the Gospels you read, these two men are either described as robbers or, in the case of Luke, as criminals. Criminals not to be intended as an insult, but as a descriptive term of someone who's committed a crime, in this case against Roman authority. So let's focus on Luke for a moment. Two others who were criminals were led away to put to death with him. So
yeah, I've always envisioned this as thieves, right? They're just two thieves. But he is about to point out something really interesting about thieves that we probably don't consider in the historical context. So check this out.
If you read it in English, the feeling you get is these two have committed a crime, they are criminals, but from Roman perspective, he isn't. Well, let's jump into interlinear Greek again. Were being led away, now also other criminals, two with him to be put to death. So to make it make sense within English syntax, were being led away, now also two other criminals with him to be put to death. In the original language, the connection of also, other, and then two actually brings forth a different perspective. Imagine it this way. If I told you, this morning I was at Starbucks with two YouTubers, this sentence doesn't tell you anything about what I do. But if the sentence was, this morning I was at Starbucks with two other YouTubers, what's my job?
Two other YouTubers? So what is he saying? What are they saying here? That Jesus was YouTuber? No, I'm joking. No, I think the point here is interesting, right? To other is alluding that Jesus was also viewed as a robber or as a criminal. Where's he going with this? This is interesting. Watch this.
Of course, this doesn't mean that Jesus was a revolutionary. It just means that from the perspective of the authorities, it is very likely that he was condemned with the accusation of sedition. What's clear about the contextualization of this word is that it's not a matter of shoplifting. These are not thieves. And another, I think, more fitting translation is revolutionaries.
So they weren't thieves. The scripture says robbers, but it may more accurately translate as revolutionaries? We got to go to the Greek. Hold on. And when they came to the place which was called Calvary, they crucified him and the malefactors, one on the right hand and one on the left hand. Okay, so here's the word for thieves in the Mark 15 passage. Okay, this is the crucifixion account in the Mark 15 passage. Masculine noun, robber, plunderer, freebooter, brigand. So Luke is using the word malefactors. So I don't know how he got this idea that it was revolutionaries from this passage, because there are different words in Luke. Luke 23:32, it says malefactors, right? So I don't know how he came to the conclusion that that is revolutionary according to Blue Letter Bible, because he didn't really give us the... See, this is why it's important to know a little bit on how to navigate around the original languages. Obviously, I'm not an expert in this stuff, but I know enough to go and let me pull it up and see what we can find, right? And so here, it's robbers, and then there, and then in the Luke version, it's malefactors. Okay, so let's go back to his video. So this is interesting. So I don't know how he came to that conclusion, but maybe he's looking at different sources.
What's clear about the contextualization of this word is that it's not a matter of shoplifting. These are not thieves. And another, I think, more fitting translation is revolutionaries. The same.
He says another more fitting translation is revolutionary. Like how and why? I wish you would have told us, why do you think it's a more fitting translation than revolutionaries? You know?
Same word, by the way, being used to describe Barabbas, who was also clearly a revolutionary. So the word can also be translated as revolutionary, insurrectionist, guerrilla. So
I could see it being them being revolutionaries and insurrectionists as well, but I would need more etymology and history here. But let's just presume he's right.
Given the fact that Barabbas was in fact arrested because of the crime of insurrection, and also looking at these words that are used the same way, it is also possible to consider the fact that these two thieves were in fact two rebels as well, which would contextualize Jesus, from the point of view of Roman authorities, to also be condemned for insurrection.
Yeah, from my understanding, I mean, I hear his point, because that's kind of wild for them to be crucifying thieves, right? Just like he stole something, right? and they get crucified for it. So they were probably, it was something more than thieves.
In other words, they considered him a rebel. So from the point of view of the Romans, they were possibly dealing with anti-Roman partisans. This was, of course, a very complex socio-political situation in Judea at the time. In the modern sense, and in our perspective, if someone comes to you and tells you Jesus is the Son of God, well, if you're a Christian, you're most likely going to say Amen. And if you're not a Christian, you're going to say that you don't believe that. However, in the classical period, there are several other possible positions to such statement. From the Romans' perspective, Son of God had two possible implications, one political, one religious. Let's examine both. The ancient Romans absolutely believed in the concept of being the Son of God. Now, politically speaking, that however meant the emperor. In other words, the Roman emperor is the Son of God.
The emperor was the Son of God, which in my opinion, if we know that the emperor was the Son of God, I could see then why they would be threatened by that, because Jesus is making, in using the title Son of God, could be viewed as a threat to the Romans as someone that is making himself equal with the emperor, who they view as divine.
From the point of view of the Romans. So to claim that someone else is the Son of God could have political implications.
Right.
Let's deeply examine and contextualize the words of Pontius Pilate, the Roman governor in Judea at the time as Jesus is presented to him. Notice how the Roman governor doesn't talk about the miracles, he doesn't talk about Jesus raising the dead or walking on water, nor does he address his teachings in any ways. He focuses on one specific thing. Are you a king? Pilate then went out unto them and said, What accusations bring ye against this man? They answered and said unto him, If he were not a malefactor, we would have not delivered him up unto...
Right, there's that word I was just looking at, right? A malefactor. Yeah, this is so interesting. Okay, let's go back to it.
Called Jesus and said unto him, Art thou the king of the Jews? Jesus answered him, Sayest thou this thing of thyself, or did other tell it thee of me? Pilate answered, Am I a Jew? Thine own nation and the chief priests have delivered thee unto me. What hast thou done? Jesus answered, My kingdom is not of this world. If my kingdom were of this world, then would my servants fight, that I should not be delivered to the Jews. But now is my kingdom not from hence.
And to be fair, I would argue that his disciples thought his kingdom was of this world. I would argue that some of them thought that he was the political Messiah. Because remember, the Jews were expecting a political Messiah to usher in peace and to liberate them from the Roman occupation. Though that is those verses in the Old Testament we would see as the second coming of Jesus, right? He's coming back as a lion. His first coming is that of a lamb. And so as Jesus is being asked, like, are you the king, right? And he's saying, my kingdom is not of this world. I think some of them did expect his kingdom to be of this world, which is probably what got him into a lot of these issues, which is ultimately in the providence of God, right?
Pilate therefore said unto him, Art thou a king then? Note once again the political fixation. Jesus answered, Thou sayest that I am a king. To this end was I born, and for this cause came I into the world, that I should bear witness unto the truth. Every one that is of the truth heareth my voice. Pilate saith unto him, What is truth? And when he had said this, he went out again unto the Jews, and saith unto them, I find in him no fault at all. So after the interrogation, the Roman governor finds no crime in Jesus. Why is that? That is because Jesus answered his political questions correctly. When he asks, Are you a king? Jesus says, My kingdom is not of this world. And that alone, from the point of view of the Roman governor, made Jesus' claim of being a king, or the Son of God, non-political. And anything religious wasn't really a big deal for the Romans. You can believe whatever you want, as long as you don't bring politics into it.
He's framing this as if the Romans didn't have as much of an issue with Jesus' religious identity, him being the Son of God, him being the Messiah, as long as he wasn't attempting to overthrow Rome, which is probably what a lot of the Jews wanted, was a political Messiah, right? A apocalyptic prophet.
So once again, immersing ourselves in the possible perspective of these legionaries, they're going to arrest an individual who has a following. Some of this following might be armed. He claims to be the son of a god of war, and some of his disciples might even qualify, from the perspective of the Romans, to the tier of zealots. And if you think about the fact that...
Right, remember earlier I said that he definitely had zealots with him. One of the disciples was, I believe, Simon the Zealot, right? So the zealots were this revolutionary, rebellious gang inside of Jews that were trying to overthrow them, and so they would have enough there to believe that Jesus wasn't just a religious figure, that perhaps he was more, which would then tingle their spidey senses.
Simon Peter was ready to fight to defend his master, probably to his death. I'd say that, yes, some of these people were very focused. Should it really surprise us that they decided to bring with them 600 armed men?
That 600 armed men thing is crazy.
Let's have a quick look at the Lex Julia vi Publica. Now, Lex meaning law, and Julia is because this law was passed by a representative of the gens Julia, or the noble family Julia. The intention of this law was to protect citizens from severe punishments at the hands of governors and magistrates, and it was passed in 50 BC. It deals with situations of RAPE, particularly when it comes to both boys, women, or in general anyone, whereby the perpetrator would be executed. But the part that we're interested in is when it comes to the possessions of weapons. This law prohibited the possession of weapons for purposes other than hunting or self-defense while traveling.
It's interesting that they had a ban on weapons. That sounds a lot like California. So they banned these folks that were Jews in Roman occupation from having weapons. It's fascinating, except for hunting.
A very specific law, and this is in 50 BC. And without going too deeply into the theory of the legal systems, by reading Cicero, Livy, and even Pliny the Younger, we see that both within the Roman Republic or the Traianic Principate, the law offered citizens a certain level of freedom that depended on the governance according to law.
We'll give you freedom, but you got to follow our rules so you can be safe.
So according to all of this, it is very likely that even if the fishermen, so the 12 apostles that were carrying weapons, even if they were trying to justify them as, well, it's just a dagger, or it's just a tool that I used during my fishing, they would have still been frowned upon, at least to a certain extent, from Roman authorities, and they would be looking at with suspicion.
Shout out to Metatron. Okay, so do you guys think that any of this changes anything about the crucifixion story? I don't think so. I think that these potentially could add more interesting details, specifically the 600 people showing up, specifically the view of Jesus as a revolutionary and not just a criminal, that the other people that were potentially crucified with him weren't just thieves or robbers, that they were actually also rebels, and Jesus was viewed as a rebel by the Romans. I think all this stuff is fascinating. I don't think this changes anything at all about the crucifixion. And an interesting fact is that Metatron actually ends up getting a lot of response from the skeptic community. I don't really know how to describe them because of his historical position on Jesus. He's done quite a few videos on this topic, okay? But there are some folks that have responded to him because they feel like like this guy right here, godless engineer, Metatron fails to prove Jesus historically existed, right? So there are folks that don't rock with Metatron because he takes the position, which I think is the logical historical position, that Jesus was a real person, that Jesus existed. And if Jesus existed, then we have to get to the next point of his existence, which is, well, was he crucified under Pilate? And if he was crucified under Pilate, well, then how did this lore of his body being missing spread? And if the tomb was really empty, then what happened? And then you got to go to the next logical step, which if the tomb was really empty, what happened? Well, scholars also agreed that his followers, without any context of what a resurrection was, believed that he was risen, that he died, literally died, and were convinced that he literally rose against any benefit to them. So I think it's a sequential thing, and I would love to hear where Metatron is on some of this stuff. Maybe I'll try to reach out to him and see if I can get an interview. But he has a pretty intensive story, pretty intensive series on all these different videos. So check him out. Like I found this one really interesting. What did Jesus really look like? Ethnicity, hair, skin, color.
See, according to the Bible, that prayer is extremely important in terms of us being transformed from the inside out when we get aligned with God's will. For the Christians watching this channel, I want you guys to implement these spiritual disciplines in your day-to-day life. And the only way I've been able to do this consistently is through writing down my prayers in a prayer journal that does a few things. One, it allows me to reflect and come to God humbly and ask him to move on my behalf. And two, it allows me to document my prayers, which ultimately help me remember the very things that I was praying for and see the hand of God tangibly in my life when he answers them. So I would urge you, consider writing down your prayers. It could be in a blank notebook. It could even be on your phone. Or you could check out the one I personally designed and used from my own quiet time and spiritual discipline that I think will be a huge blessing. It's the exact structure and system that I've used for years to pray and be more consistent in my spiritual disciplines. You can pick yours up today by clicking the link in the pinned comment below. All right, I'll see you over there. Peace.